A bitter wind howled through the city streets, biting at the skin of those unlucky enough to be outside. Among them was a woman bundled in layers of mismatched clothes, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets to ward off the cold. Her face told a story of survival, lines etched by hardship, eyes that held a lifetime of unshed tears, and a chin lifted high, as if daring the world to break her spirit. She walked slowly, her steps deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of years spent navigating life without a safety net. The city was alive that evening, buzzing with the energy of people rushing to holiday parties, lavish dinners, and late-night shopping sprees. Glittering lights danced in the windows of luxury stores, and the sound of laughter spilled from high-end restaurants. But for her, the streets weren't a temporary stop on the way to somewhere warm. They were home. She stopped outside an upscale hotel, its grand façade glowing with festive lights. Through the glass doors, she saw opulence, chandeliers dripping with crystals, guests dressed in designer clothes, and servers carrying trays of champagne. Her stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that kept her staring. It was curiosity. What would it feel like, she wondered, to belong to a world like that, even for a night? As if fate had heard her thoughts, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a man dressed in an impeccable suit, his aura commanding attention. He handed a valet the keys before turning toward the entrance, but not before his eyes locked with hers. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. She looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring, but when she glanced back, he was still watching her. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and unexpected, cutting through the icy air. "Are you okay?" She hesitated. People didn't usually stop to talk to her, let alone ask questions like that. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but guarded. She started to turn away, but he stopped her with his next words. "You hungry?" he asked, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp bill and held it out to her. "Go get yourself something to eat." Her pride screamed at her to say no, but the gnawing in her stomach had its own voice. She accepted the money with a quiet thank you and tried to leave, but again, he surprised her. "Actually," he said, studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy, "how about you join me tonight?" She blinked, certain she hadn't heard him right. "What?" "There's a party upstairs," he explained, gesturing toward the hotel. "It's nothing too crazy. Just a few people, good food, some music. You might enjoy it." Her instincts screamed at her to decline. She didn't belong in places like that, and she definitely didn't trust strangers who made strange offers. But something about his tone, it wasn't pity, and it wasn't condescension. It was genuine, almost as if he really meant it. She hesitated. "Why would you invite me?" He shrugged. "Maybe because you look like you could use a good night. Or maybe I could." The words hung between them, heavy with an unspoken truth she couldn't quite decipher. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly, almost to herself. He smiled, stepping aside to hold the door open. As she walked past him, the warmth of the lobby wrapped around her like a hug. It was overwhelming, the smells, the lights, the sheer luxury of it all. She felt every pair of eyes on her, but the man beside her didn't seem to notice or care. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, her heart pounding louder with every passing second. When the doors finally opened, the scene that greeted her took her breath away. It wasn't just a party, it was another world. Laughter echoed through the massive room, people mingled around artfully arranged platters of food, and a live band played soft jazz in the corner. The scent of fresh roses filled the air. But just as she began to take it all in, something shifted. Eyes turned toward her, and whispers began to ripple through the crowd. She could feel the judgment, the unspoken question on everyone's lips. Who is she, and why is she here? Her feet faltered, but before she could retreat, the man placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "You're my guest." It was meant to comfort her, but instead, it made her more aware of how out of place she was. And as the crowd began to part, she saw someone stepping forward, a woman dressed in a gown that probably cost more than she'd made in her entire life. The woman's expression wasn't just curious, it was hostile. "Well, this is unexpected," the woman said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Who's your friend?" Before the man could answer, a voice rang out from the far side of the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is that her? The woman everyone's been talking about?" All heads turned toward the source, and the room fell silent. She froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. The room's silence felt heavier than the glimmering chandelier overhead. Her heart hammered in her chest, her instincts screaming to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. The man who had brought her stepped closer, placing himself slightly between her and the woman in the gown. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight of protection she didn't know she needed. "She's my guest," he said firmly, his tone making it clear he wouldn't entertain further questions. Yet, the murmurings continued, low and sharp, like static in the background. The woman's gaze didn't soften. "Your guest? That's unusual. You don't usually show up with anyone, let alone someone so unexpected." Her eyes flicked over the woman's coat, her scuffed shoes, her entire being, and the judgment was palpable. "I don't think I owe anyone here an explanation," the man replied coolly, his voice steady but with an edge that silenced the whispers for the moment. He turned back to her, his smile warm and encouraging. "Come on. Let's get you something to eat." She followed him through the crowd, her shoulders tense under the weight of the stairs. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, laughter layered with undertones of gossip. She wanted to shrink into herself, but his steady presence at her side kept her moving. They reached a long table lined with platters of food that looked too beautiful to touch, delicate canapés, perfectly arranged fruit, and desserts that gleamed like jewels. He handed her a plate, his tone light. "Go ahead. Try anything you like." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the plate. The sight of so much food felt overwhelming, and she suddenly felt self-conscious. "I don't even know what half of this is," she admitted quietly. He chuckled. "That makes two of us. Just pick what looks good." As she cautiously selected a few items, she couldn't help but notice the lingering glances. She felt like an exhibit, a curiosity no one quite understood. And then she heard it, a hushed voice, loud enough to catch her ear. "I heard she's some random woman he picked up off the street. Can you imagine?" Her grip on the plate tightened, the words slicing through her like a blade. She turned to leave, but he caught her arm gently, stopping her. "Don't let them get to you," he said, his voice low but firm. "They don't matter." "But I don't belong here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not like them." "Exactly," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "And that's what makes you worth knowing." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. He led her to a quieter corner of the room, away from the prying eyes. They sat near a grand window that overlooked the city, the lights sprawling out like a sea of stars. "You must think I'm crazy," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "Inviting a stranger to a party like this." She looked at him, her guard still up. "I don't know what to think." "Why did you?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I guess I saw someone who reminded me of me. Once upon a time." She frowned. You don't look like someone who's ever struggled." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Appearances can be deceiving. You think everyone in this room has it all together, but trust me, most of them are just as lost as anyone else. They just hide it better." She studied him, trying to decipher if he was being genuine. "Why tell me this?" "Because I think you deserve to hear it," he said simply. "You've probably spent a lot of time thinking people like them are above you. But they're not." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe him. But then reality set back in, and she shook her head. "It doesn't change the fact that I'm still me, and they're still them." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a shadow loomed over them. It was the woman in the gown, her expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, though it didn't feel like a question. The man hesitated but eventually nodded. She pulled up a chair, her movements graceful and deliberate. Her eyes flicked to the plate in the woman's hands. "Enjoying the food?" She nodded, unsure how to respond. The woman's smile was polite but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "You're quite the enigma tonight. Everyone's curious about you." "There's nothing to be curious about," she said quietly, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. "Oh, I doubt that," the woman replied, her gaze piercing. "Someone doesn't just end up here by accident. Especially not with him." She gestured toward the man, who frowned but said nothing. Before the conversation could continue, a loud laugh rang out from across the room, drawing their attention. A group of men had gathered near the bar, their voices carrying over the music. One of them, clearly drunk, pointed in their direction. "Hey!" he called out, his words slurred but his intention clear. "Is she the entertainment for tonight?" The room went silent again, all eyes turning to her. Her face burned with humiliation, and she started to rise, but the man beside her stood first, his expression dark. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Show some respect." The drunk man laughed, unfazed. "Respect? For what? She's not even supposed to be here." The man took a step forward, his posture protective, but the woman in the gown intervened. "Let's not make a scene," she said smoothly, though her eyes glinted with something unreadable. "It's just a misunderstanding." But it wasn't. It was everything she'd feared, laid bare for everyone to see. And as she sat there, her plate untouched, she realized that whatever this night had started as, it was far from over. Something deeper was unfolding, and she was caught in the middle of it, whether she liked it or not. The silence that followed was suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to look around the room, afraid of the faces she'd see, some filled with pity, others with amusement, and most with judgment. The man beside her, however, stood his ground, his shoulders squared and his jaw tight. He wasn't going to let this go, but she wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. "I think it's time you left," he said, his voice calm but firm, addressing the drunken man. The weight of his tone left no room for argument, and for a moment, it seemed to work. The man wavered, looking as if he might back down, but then he sneered. "Relax," he said, throwing his hands up mockingly. "Didn't mean anything by it. Just seems odd, you know? You, of all people, bringing her." He waved a hand toward her, as if she were an object instead of a person. Her chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling inside her: humiliation, anger, and a deep, aching sense of not belonging. She hated this. She hated being the center of attention, hated the way her very presence seemed to disrupt their perfectly curated world. "I think I should go," she said quietly, standing up and setting the untouched plate down on the table. She didn't wait for anyone to respond. She just needed to leave, to get out of this place that felt more suffocating with every passing second. But before she could take more than a few steps, the man caught her arm gently, stopping her. "Wait," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Don't let them win. You don't have to leave." She shook her head, her throat tight with unshed tears. "This was a mistake. I don't belong here." "You do," he insisted, his eyes searching hers for something trust, maybe, or courage. They don't get to decide that. You belong wherever you want to be. His words were kind, but they felt distant, like they were meant for someone else. Someone stronger, someone who didn't feel like an intruder in a world she'd never been invited into. She pulled away from him, her movements quick and decisive. "I'm sorry," she said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. She made it to the elevator without looking back. As the doors closed, shutting out the muffled sounds of the party, she let out a shaky breath. The ride down felt endless, her reflection in the mirrored walls a harsh reminder of how out of place she'd been. By the time the doors opened, she was ready to disappear into the night. But the moment she stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin, she realized she had nowhere to go. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, and she was just another shadow slipping through its streets. She didn't make it far before she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see the man, but it was someone else, a woman she recognized from the party. She was younger than most of the guests, her dress simple compared to the others, but there was something about her presence that was commanding. "Wait," the woman called out, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Please don't go." She stopped, unsure of what to say. The woman approached her slowly, her expression kind but tinged with something else, concern, maybe, or curiosity. "I'm sorry about what happened back there," the woman said. "That was uncalled for." She shrugged, her hands buried deep in her pockets. "It's not your fault." "No," the woman agreed, "but that doesn't make it right." She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "Look, I know what it's like to feel out of place in a room like that. It's not easy, but you handled it better than most people would have." She frowned, unsure how to respond. The woman's words felt genuine, but they also felt strange, coming from someone who clearly belonged to the world she just fled from. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because I think you deserve to know that not everyone in there is like them," the woman replied, her tone earnest. "And because I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment she let herself believe them, let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as out of place as she felt. But the moment passed quickly, reality crashing back in. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said, her voice quiet, "but I don't think it matters. People like me don't get to be part of that world." The woman's expression softened, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. "Maybe not," she said, "but that doesn't mean you can't change it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The woman didn't press her, just nodded and stepped back, giving her space. "If you ever need someone to talk to," the woman said, pulling a small card from her purse and handing it to her, "call me. My name's Elise." She took the card hesitantly, glancing at the name and number printed in elegant script. "Thanks," she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. Elise smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, before turning and heading back toward the hotel. She watched her go, the card clutched tightly in her hand, and for the first time that night, she felt something other than humiliation. She felt the faintest flicker of hope. But as she turned and walked away, the city's cold embrace reminding her of all the reasons she didn't belong in places like that, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Something about that night, about the man who'd invited her and the woman who'd followed her, felt unfinished, like a thread waiting to be pulled. And deep down, she knew that whether she wanted it or not, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to understand. The days following that night felt like a blur. She spent most of them wandering the streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. The card from Elise sat in her pocket, an unfamiliar weight that both comforted and unsettled her. She didn't know why she hadn't thrown it away. Maybe it was the kindness Elise had shown her, or maybe it was the strange hope she felt after their conversation, but the thought of reaching out felt like a lifeline she wasn't sure she could hold on to. Every time she passed the Grand Hotel where the party had been, a knot twisted in her stomach. She tried to avoid it, but it was impossible. The memory of the looks, the whispers, the feeling of being an outsider in a room that was never meant for her, haunted her. It was a constant reminder of how fragile her place in the world really was. But as the week wore on, she found herself standing in front of the hotel's entrance, her fingers nervously brushing against Elisa's card. She could feel her pulse quicken as she considered walking away, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that she had been offered a chance one she might never get again. Maybe it was the memory of the man who had invited her, the only person who had ever treated her like she mattered in that world. Without fully understanding why, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The lobby was as opulent as she remembered, with its high ceilings and expensive furniture. It felt like stepping into a dream, one that she wasn't sure she belonged to. She could hear the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, but she didn't feel like she was a part of it. Her feet felt heavy as she moved through the space, her eyes darting nervously from one face to another, but no one seemed to notice her. She reached the elevator, her heart pounding. The doors slid open, and as she stepped inside, the silence enveloped her. The familiar feeling of being out of place returned, but this time, she pushed it aside. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. When the elevator doors opened to the penthouse floor, she almost turned around. The party inside was even more lavish than she remembered, voices, laughter, and music filling the air. People were mingling, laughing, their expensive outfits glistening under the soft light. It felt like another world. She swallowed hard and stepped out, the weight of every eye in the room on her as soon as she appeared. The tension in the room was immediate, thick and palpable. She could feel the shift in energy, the way people paused and glanced at each other, whispers rising like a tide. She wished she could disappear into the walls, but her feet were rooted to the spot. And then, like before, the man appeared. He was standing across the room, talking to a group of people, but the moment his eyes met hers, everything else faded away. He excused himself and walked toward her, his expression softening as he got closer. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost surprised. She nodded, unsure of what to say. She didn't belong here, but neither of them seemed to care about that. "I wasn't sure if you'd show," he added, his smile warm, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "But I'm glad you did." I don't belong here," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't know why I came back." He shook his head gently. "You belong here as much as anyone else." But the words didn't feel right. Something was off, and the longer she stood there, the more she realized it wasn't just the room that made her uncomfortable. It was him too. There was a hidden tension in his gaze, something she couldn't place but couldn't ignore either. Before she could ask him what was going on, the woman in the gown from the previous night appeared at his side, her eyes narrowing as she took in the situation. She glanced at the woman, then back to him, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, well," the woman said, her tone dripping with something between amusement and disdain. "I see the invitation didn't come with a warning." The man's smile faltered, his expression hardening. "What's that supposed to mean?" The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering him, then turned her gaze back to the woman. "Let's just say, some people have a tendency to invite the wrong kinds of guests." Her eyes flicked up and down, as if sizing her up. "People who don't quite fit in." The air in the room grew even thicker, the whispers growing louder. She felt like a spectacle, an exhibit for everyone to judge. The man's hand rested on her arm, but she could feel the shift in his demeanor. He was no longer the protector he had seemed before. Something had changed, and she wasn't sure if she liked it. "You're not being fair," he said, his voice tight now. Fair? The woman laughed softly, her eyes glinting. Life's not fair. We all know that. She looked directly at the woman, her smile wide and fake. You should know that more than anyone, shouldn't you? The words stung, and her heart dropped into her stomach. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the door at the far end of the room burst open, drawing everyone's attention. A group of new arrivals stepped inside, the last one entering with an air of authority that immediately commanded the room. The man at the front was older, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his face lined with experience and power. He exuded a presence that was undeniable, and the room seemed to fall silent in his wake. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, the air suddenly feeling even heavier than before. The man scanned the room, his eyes briefly landing on her before moving on. And just like that, she knew something had shifted again. She could feel it in her gut. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than her. The tension in the air wasn't just about her presence anymore. It was about something darker, something more dangerous. Her mind raced as she stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of it all pressing down on her. What was happening? Why was she here? And what did any of it mean? The older man's gaze lingered for a moment longer on her, and she could feel the sharpness in his eyes, as though he was sizing her up. Then, without a word, he turned his attention to the man beside her, and the conversation shifted. But the look that had passed between them didn't escape her. Something had been set in motion. The question now was whether she was prepared for what was coming next. The silence that followed the older man's gaze felt suffocating, like the room had been frozen in time. She stood still, her heart pounding, as if every second was a beat too long. The older man didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her any further. Instead, he turned his attention to the man beside her, his words low, but they carried a weight that made the air crackle. I trust you've been handling things, the older man said, his voice smooth and commanding, the kind of voice that demanded respect without raising its volume. The man beside her nodded, but there was a tension in his shoulders now that she hadn't noticed before. She couldn't read it. Was it guilt? Or something else? Whatever it was, it made her feel like an outsider again, more than she ever had before. What's going on? She whispered, her voice barely audible, but the man beside her seemed to hear it anyway. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the older man, then back at her. The unease in his eyes didn't escape her. I didn't expect things to escalate like this, he said quietly, though it wasn't clear who he was talking to. Maybe it was more to himself than to her. His eyes shifted nervously, his fingers drumming against the edge of his drink, a subtle but unmistakable sign of anxiety. Before she could ask what he meant, the older man made a slight movement with his hand, a gesture that seemed to command everyone's attention. The murmurs in the room died down instantly, and every eye in the room was suddenly on them, on the man who had been speaking to her. You've made a bold choice, bringing her into this, the older man said, his tone no longer gentle but edged with something colder. But this is beyond your control now. She felt the chill of his words like ice water running through her veins. Her mouth went dry. She had no idea what they were talking about, what they were really talking about, but she could feel the room shift, the energy turn. The whispers started again, louder this time, but this time, they weren't just about her. They were about them, about him, about decisions being made that she couldn't understand, but could feel deep in her bones. The man beside her opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the woman in the gown appeared again, moving smoothly through the crowd as though she were a predator closing in for the kill. Her eyes flicked between the man and the older man, her lips curled into that sharp, calculating smile. You never could keep things simple, she said, her voice carrying a bite now. The tension between the man and the woman was palpable, thick enough to cut through the room. I'm not the one complicating things, he snapped back, his voice suddenly hard. She was surprised by the change in his demeanor. This wasn't the same man who had so carefully guided her earlier. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The protective warmth had evaporated, replaced by a cold edge she hadn't seen before. The woman stepped closer to him, her gaze intense, almost predatory. "You're playing with fire, and you know it. Bringing someone like her into this is only going to make everything worse." Her pulse quickened, the weight of her words sinking in. Who were they talking about? Who was she? She wasn't just some random woman to them anymore, not just an outsider, she was a problem. And they were making her feel it with every glance, every whisper. "Enough," the older man interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. His eyes were now locked on her, not with the cold calculation of the woman, but with something even more dangerous: disappointment. "The time for games is over." The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone awaited his next move. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the room pulling in around her like the walls were closing in. What was happening? She had no idea, but she felt herself being pulled deeper into something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. Suddenly, the older man's gaze shifted from her to the man beside her, his face hardening. "You've made a mistake. A mistake that's going to have consequences." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Do you understand that?" The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, the earlier calm replaced with an unease that mirrored her own. She could see him struggling, his eyes darting between the older man and the woman in the gown. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement, and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, a smile curving on her lips. "Maybe it's time to face the consequences," she said, her voice laced with a venom that sent a chill down her spine. She felt her breath catch in her throat. What did they mean? What was she being dragged into? It wasn't just a party anymore. It wasn't just a place where she didn't belong. It was a game, and she was caught in the middle of it, whether she liked it or not. Before she could even begin to process the implications, the older man turned his attention back to her. His eyes were no longer calculating, but something colder, dispassionate, even cruel. "You've been playing a role here, haven't you?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. "And you don't even realize it, do you?" Her head spun as the weight of his words hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was speechless, lost in the flood of emotions, confusion, and fear that rushed over her like a tidal wave. "This," the older man continued, his voice steady, "is bigger than all of you. You're just a small piece of the puzzle. And now, because of your presence, we have to deal with complications." She looked at him, the confusion in her eyes growing deeper. What did he mean? She wasn't some pawn in their game, was she? She hadn't asked for any of this. But the older man didn't seem interested in her questions. He was already turning, his eyes shifting to the man beside her. "Fix it. Before it's too late." And just like that, the room went cold. The moment stretched out, pregnant with unspoken tension. The man beside her, the one who had invited her, seemed to shrink before her eyes, his earlier confidence shattered. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. It was as if something had broken inside him. She stood there, frozen, trying to piece together fragments of what was happening, but pieces weren't fitting. One thing was clear: nothing about this night was what it had seemed. The stakes had been raised, and she was no longer just a stranger at a party. She was at the center of something far more dangerous. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, she heard at the faintest rustle of movement, the sharp click of a door opening. The sound of a new player entering the game. The door creaked open, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Every head in the room turned toward the figure standing in the doorway. At first, she couldn't make out who it was, just a silhouette framed by the dim light spilling in from the hallway. But then the figure stepped forward, revealing a man, his sharp suit and calm demeanor instantly recognizable. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room as though he had seen it all before. The older man's expression darkened the moment he saw him. "You," he said, his voice low and controlled, but there was a flicker of surprise, maybe even fear, beneath it. The newcomer didn't acknowledge him right away. His gaze shifted, landing first on the man beside her, then moving swiftly to her. His eyes were intense, but there was something almost familiar in his look, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. And then it hit her. She knew him. The man who had stood by her at the party, the one who had acted like her protector, had a connection to this newcomer. The two were more than just acquaintances. There was history here, deep, complicated history. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The man moved forward, his steps slow but deliberate. The air grew thick with anticipation, with every person in the room now holding their breath. She could feel their eyes on her, but it wasn't just curiosity now, it was fear. They were all waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The newcomer finally spoke, his voice steady, yet with a note of finality. "I should have known it would come to this," he said, his eyes never leaving the man beside her. His words weren't directed at her, but she could feel the weight of them. "You've made a lot of mistakes, haven't you? But this..." He paused, glancing at her, then back at the older man. "This is where it ends." There was a sudden shift in the room. The man beside her looked as though the floor had just dropped out from under him. His face went pale, his lips pressing together tightly, but he didn't respond. The weight of the newcomer's words seemed to have stunned him into silence, and for a brief moment, she wondered if it was regret she saw in his eyes. But before anyone could react further, the older man took a step forward, his posture rigid. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, his voice colder now, sharper. "This isn't just about you or her or..." "No, it's not," the newcomer interrupted, cutting him off. His tone had changed, now carrying an edge of anger, as though the older man's words no longer mattered. "It's about the choices you've made. About the power you thought you had, the lies you've told." The tension in the room became unbearable. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, like she was caught in the middle of a battle she didn't understand. And as much as she wanted to escape, to leave this all behind, something kept her rooted to the spot. The newcomer turned to face her, his eyes softening just a fraction. "I know you're confused," he said quietly. "I know you don't understand why all this is happening. But trust me, you were never meant to be a pawn in this game. You were a choice." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. A choice? What did that mean? She looked at him, desperate for answers, but before she could ask, the older man's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding. "No more games," he spat, his eyes locking onto the newcomer. "You don't control this anymore. I've played the cards I was given." The newcomer's gaze flickered toward the older man, and in that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected, a look of pity. For a brief second, it seemed like the newcomer wasn't the enemy. It was as if he had seen the older man's arrogance and weakness for what it truly was. But there was no time for sympathy. Without another word, he moved toward the man beside her, the two of them standing face to face now, as if something unspoken passed between them. She looked from one to the other, her confusion mounting. What was going on? Why was this happening? She wasn't part of this world, she hadn't chosen any of it, yet here she was, at the center of everything. And then, as if on cue, the woman in the gown stepped forward, a smirk playing on her lips. "I told you," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You should have never brought her into this." But before anyone could react, the newcomer's eyes flashed, and in an instant, he was standing between the woman and the man beside her. "You," he said to her, his voice low and controlled. "You've been playing both sides. You thought you were safe, didn't you? But you're not. Not anymore." The woman's face twisted, her smile faltering. For a moment, she seemed taken aback, but only for a moment. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think he is going to save you?" The tension that had been simmering for so long reached its peak. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then, in the blink of an eye, the situation shifted. The man beside her, the one who had once seemed so certain, took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously from the older man to the newcomer. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for her arm, but there was something in his eyes now, something she couldn't place. But it wasn't the confidence he had shown earlier. Before she could process what was happening, the truth hit her like a freight train. The man beside her wasn't just a bystander. He wasn't just a good Samaritan who had offered her a moment of kindness. He was a part of this world, this dangerous, ruthless world that she had been drawn into without even realizing it. He had been using her, just like the others. The connection to the newcomer, it wasn't just coincidence. He had known all along what was at stake. Her chest tightened as the realization settled in. She had been a pawn all along. But what neither of them realized was that she was no longer willing to play by their rules. In one swift motion, she pulled away from him, her eyes now locked onto the newcomer. Her voice was steady, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "I don't need anyone to save me," she said, her words surprising even herself. The tension in the room reached its breaking point, and for the first time that night, she felt the power shift in her favor. The older man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can walk away from this? You have no idea what you're dealing with." She didn't flinch. "I don't care what you think," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't your world. It's mine now." And just as the room seemed to shudder with the weight of her words, the newcomer's eyes softened, almost approving. For a split second, it felt like she was the one in control. The final twist hit her all at once. She wasn't just part of this world. She was changing the rules. As she stood there, surrounded by the tension, the power, the drama, she realized the truth. The party, the game, the manipulation, it was never about them. It had always been about her. And no one was going to tell her how it would end. The silence that followed her words was deafening. For a moment, it felt like the entire room had been frozen, caught in a suspended moment of disbelief. She could feel their eyes, each one probing her, trying to decipher whether she was truly serious, or if she was simply caught in the heat of the moment. But she didn't falter. She didn't shrink back. She held her ground, the weight of everything that had brought her here making her stronger, more resolute. The older man's lips twitched as though he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. She didn't know if he was angry because she had dared to challenge him, or because he had underestimated her from the beginning. Either way, it didn't matter. "You think this is over?" The older man's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. But she didn't flinch. She was done playing by their rules, done with their manipulations. The woman in the gown, who had been the source of so much of the tension earlier, was now glaring at her with a cold fury, her eyes narrowing. But the newcomer, the one who had stepped into this tangled mess of power and secrets, was watching her with a different look, something softer, like he was finally starting to understand her. It wasn't pity, but something else. Something akin to respect. The man beside her, the one who had invited her to this madness in the first place, seemed to shrink further under the weight of everything. He took a step back, almost as if trying to distance himself from her, from the chaos that had exploded around them. She saw the fear in his eyes now, not the confidence he had shown when they first met. She could feel it, the shift. The realization that he was just as much a pawn in this game as she had been. For the first time, she saw him for what he truly was, another player in a game that had never been hers to begin with. And with that realization, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just a passive player in their world anymore. She wasn't here to be saved. She was here to change everything. Enough of this, she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Enough of the lies. Enough of the power games. I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm done playing along. The words weren't just directed at them. They were directed at herself. She wasn't going to let them control her narrative anymore. She had taken back her power in that moment, and there was no going back. The older man looked at her, his eyes narrowing with what could only be described as grudging respect. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice colder than before. "But you'll regret it." "I don't think I will," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The room seemed to hold its breath again, as though waiting for anything to happen. The stakes were high now, and everyone knew it. The power dynamic had shifted, and there was no telling how it would all play out. The newcomer, who had been watching quietly up until now, finally spoke. "He's right," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "But you've already made your decision. And that's what matters." She turned to look at him, surprised by his sudden words. "What do you mean?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. "You've taken control of your own fate," he said. "And that's something they'll never understand. They'll always play their game, but you've decided you're not going to be a part of it anymore." The older man's face twisted with frustration, but before he could say anything more, the woman in the gown spoke up, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think they'll let you?" "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice firm. "I'm stepping into my own future." There was a beat of silence, and then, just like that, the tension in the room began to unravel. The older man turned sharply, his face darkening as he walked away without another word. The woman in the gown, who had been so sure of herself, now seemed unsure, glancing around as if searching for something. The man beside her, who had once been her anchor in this strange, dangerous world, stood silently, his face a mixture of regret and resignation. But for the first time, she didn't feel lost. She didn't feel small. She felt like she had finally found her voice. The newcomer's gaze softened. "You've done it," he said quietly. "You've taken control." She nodded, feeling the weight of it all settling into her bones. The room was no longer filled with the same oppressive energy. It felt lighter, almost liberated. She had faced the darkness, had looked the danger in the eye, and had come out on the other side stronger than ever. But just as she was beginning to breathe easier, there was a shift in the air. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made her stomach churn. She looked around, her senses heightened. Something wasn't right. The newcomer seemed to notice it too. He stepped closer to her, his expression alert. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice a little shaky now, her instincts telling her that the game wasn't quite over yet. Before he could respond, the door to the room slammed open again, and in walked someone else, another player, one she hadn't expected. A tall man, with a face she didn't recognize but who seemed familiar in an unsettling way. He wasn't dressed in the same high-end attire as the others, but there was something about him that exuded authority. The room went silent again as the newcomer's eyes flickered toward him. "What is this?" he demanded. The tall man didn't answer at first. He simply surveyed the room, his eyes landing on each of them, one by one. And when his gaze finally landed on her, she felt a jolt of recognition. This was no ordinary man. He wasn't a part of this world, but he had the look of someone who had been pulled into it by circumstance. "You've made a mistake," the tall man said, his voice low and measured. "You think you've taken control, but you're still in the game. And the rules? They're not yours to break." Her stomach twisted. She had thought she was free, had thought she had finally escaped their world of manipulation and control. But now, standing in front of her, was a man who made it clear that nothing had changed. She looked at the newcomer, her heart pounding. This wasn't over. Not yet. But then, the unexpected happened. The man beside her, the one who had invited her in the first place, stepped forward, his face hardening. Enough, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. We're done with this. It ends now. The tall man's eyes narrowed. You think you can just walk away from it all? You think you're in control? We are, the man beside her said, his voice unwavering. This ends now. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, as though the weight of everything was coming to a head. She had no idea how things would end. She had no idea who was really in control anymore. But as she stood there, her heart still racing, one thing was clear: she had taken control of her fate, and no matter what happened next, no one could take that from her. The tall man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the newcomer and the man beside her. Finally, with a look of resigned defeat, he nodded, turning to leave the room without another word. And just like that, it was over. The game, the manipulations, the lies, it was all finished. The world she had been drawn into seemed to dissolve in front of her, leaving her standing in the rubble, but this time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't a pawn. She was the one who had rewritten the rules. As the last of the tension lifted from the room, the newcomer turned to her with a quiet smile. You've done it. You've truly taken control. She nodded, feeling the weight of everything slowly ease from her shoulders. I'm not walking away. I'm stepping into something new. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it on her terms.